It's the weekend and you have financial questions that need answering. That can only mean one thing. It's time for Jill on Money, the show that takes the mystery out of your finances. Here's your host, Jill Schlesinger.
Welcome to the Jill on Money Show. I hope you had a Merry Christmas if you celebrated. If you didn't celebrate and it was just another couple of days for you, I hope you had a good few days. It is delightful that we are joining you this weekend. Thanks so much for listening. We're broadcasting from the Capital One Bank virtual studios. Capital One, this is banking reimagined. What's in your wallet? So just want to remind all of you that during these holiday times, Mark and I decided it would be a fun thing to get some interviews that maybe didn't air. There were things we recorded before the pandemic. So as a result, we are now airing some stuff. We will not be doing questions this weekend or next weekend. It's going to be interviews. If you want questions and answers and all of that, you can still send us an email, askjill@jillonmoney.com. And I would encourage you to subscribe to our sister broadcast. It is a podcast. It's called Jill on Money. And you can get it on Apple or Stitcher or Spotify or radio.com, Google Play, wherever you get podcasts. And if you don't know how to get a podcast, find someone who can help you out. Okay, so just want to introduce quickly our first guest, Annie Duke. She's been on the show before. She had written a book called Thinking in Bets. She was a professional poker player. She's here with her new book, How to Decide: Simple Tools for Making Better Choices. So it's our interview with Annie Duke. Here we go. Why do we do this? Why do we conflate outcome and decision making?
Yeah, so this is a problem which is called resulting. And you can see why. It's basically saying if I know what the result is, then that tells me whether the decision is good. You know, if the result is good, the decision is good. If the result is bad, the decision is bad. And I think there's a couple of reasons why we do it. There's a process called substitution where when something is like really hard to judge, then we'll substitute something that's easier to judge. So it's actually hard to tell for most decisions whether they're good or bad. They're mostly not as clear as I went through a red light or a green light. They're things like, you know, should I have hired that person that worked out or didn't? Or should I have chosen a particular sales strategy over another? Should I have spent so much time with that client that I ended up not closing? These are things that are actually quite hard to answer in terms of what the quality of the decision process is. But judging the quality of the outcome is quite easy. You know, it's essentially I won or lost. It worked out poorly or not. And we end up substituting the judgment of that for the judgment of the decision quality. So I think that's one reason why we get this resulting thing. And then I think the other reason is that while there are many, many futures, there's only one past. And once we know what the past is, it feels like it had to be that way, that was the only thing that could have actually happened. And if it's the only thing that could have actually happened, then that would tell you what you need to know about the decision. You know, if it was destiny that I was going to have a bad outcome, then the decision to do whatever I did must have been poor. And if it was destiny that I was going to have that good outcome, then the decision to do what I did must have been great. But the world isn't deterministic in that way. There's just plain influence of luck for one thing.
I love the idea that you put luck front and center. I really do, because as you said, you know, you can blow through a red light and not get into an accident. You were lucky, right? Talk about luck and even resulting amid a pandemic. I think that there are a lot of people who are running around this country and saying, you know, I've been around people for the last 8 months. Nothing's happened to me, the past. Therefore, I will continue this behavior. That's how I made my decision. Talk a little bit about the luck aspect of this.
Yeah, so actually that's really insightful. And I think it's really important because I think some people say, well, what's the problem with resulting? And the problem with resulting is that it actually affects the decisions that you make in the future. And as you just said, with a pandemic, that can cause you to make some very bad decisions that have quite enormous consequences. So basically what happens is that obviously you can make horrible decisions and have a good outcome because the outcome is probabilistic. So anytime that you go out and you're around other people, there's some probability that you can get coronavirus, but it's not anywhere close to 100% of the time. But you are taking on risk. So if I go to a large political rally and I don't wear a mask, or I go into a grocery store and I don't wear a mask, or I have people over to my house and I don't wear a mask, we can take as an example, I think in New York right now, it might be a little higher now, but a few days ago, if you gathered with 10 people, there was a 10% chance that one of those people had coronavirus. But obviously that means that 90% of the time you're going to come away unscathed. So when you have those people over to your house and you happen to be lucky, have nobody have coronavirus, and then it turns out fine and nothing happens to you, you then will think that that's a good decision and you'll repeat it. But as anybody in finance knows, when you have a 10% chance of a bad outcome and you keep repeating that, it doesn't take long until there's a 100% chance that you actually end up in front of somebody with coronavirus indoors without a mask. And guess what? You're going to get sick. Then you're going to spread that to other people. So I think that what we don't understand is that just because something worked out fine, I had 10 people over to my house and nothing happened, it doesn't mean it was a good decision, because at least in New York right now, there's a 10% chance that somebody has coronavirus. And by the way, if you're in a place like the Dakotas now, you're in the 70 or 80% chance that among those 10 people, someone has coronavirus.
This seems to me a problem of people who don't understand how statistics work. And I'm just going to bring myself back to, say, 2016, when I remember walking out of the CBS Broadcast Center on Election Day, and somebody looked at me and he says, "Clinton all the way, huh?" I said, "What makes you say that?" He's, it looks like a 70% chance Clinton. And I said, "Do you understand on a probability basis how massive a 30% chance is?"
Right.
And he's like, "Do you understand how that is insane in terms of the way that statistics work?" So I'm wondering if sometimes, and I've been thinking about this with the polling, with the virus, that people just really have a hard time with the math or the theory behind all of this. How can we help them understand this a little bit better?
There's actually a bias, which is that we tend to think in binaries or dichotomies. So it's a binary thinking bias. So that's kind of what's happening in the Clinton example, right? It's very hard for us to sort of say that, she has a 70% chance of winning, and instead we want to think about it as win or loss. And you can see that in the pandemic as well. People think about live or die as an example, and that they don't think in between, which is, well, what if I get it, but then I'm sick for 6 months, or there's long-term damage, or how long am I going to be sick? What's that going to be like? They want to just think about the dichotomy, live or die. I think that there's a couple of ways to help people to really think probabilistically a little bit better. One is to actually create some stakes around it. So one of the ways that I got people to that place with the Clinton example was to say, well, imagine that you had a gun that had 10 chambers in it, and 3 of those chambers had bullets in them. Would you play Russian roulette?
Mm-hmm.
And of course, the answer immediately is no.
Right.
Right. So when you all of a sudden force them into thinking about the consequences of whatever that probability is, which 30% is quite significant, it actually helps them to get there.
We'll get back to our interview with Annie Duke in just a minute. But during the break, if you do have a question, send us an email. Ask Jill at jillonmoney.com. So stay tuned. More with Annie Duke coming up in just a moment.
Back to Jill on Money, where Jill Schlesinger helps you take the mystery out of your finances.
You're back. It's Jill on Money. And if you've got a financial question, we'd love to hear from you. You know what I forgot to tell you is that we've got a bunch of information about the new stimulus package that was passed. You can just go on to our website, jillonmoney.com. If you're in the read section, you'll see it there. But if you want, just go to the resource section and you'll see about the new stimulus plan. Lots of goodies in there. It's not quite as big as I would like, but considering that it could have been zero and it's $900 billion, kind of happy. Got to tell you. Okay, so we're going back to our interview with Annie Duke. She is a scientist, like a data scientist, really smart. She also wrote a book called Thinking in Bets, which was all about making smarter decisions when you don't have all the facts. That comes from her background as a professional poker player. Her new book, How to Decide, just kind of draws on some of the big themes that she wrote about in her book, Thinking in Bets. I love talking to her. One of the things that we really do dive into is our love of numbers. And, we're sort of a society that doesn't like math that much. I don't know why. It's very easy. So, in this part of our interview, we talked to Annie about odds and percentages. I think, Mark, that if we just taught odds and percentages in school, just as like a major league lesson in how to play craps, we might have better outcomes with our students. I don't know if you make it tangible. I don't know, just an idea. Here's more of our interview with Annie Duke.
Another thing you can do is actually get people to live in what the other things that could have happened were. So if you think about something like, well, I hired this person and they didn't work out, so therefore it must have been a terrible decision, because you're not thinking probabilistically about, what are the other things that could have happened and what were the likelihoods of those. You can have someone essentially reconstruct those trees, and you can say, well, what were the other ways that it could have turned out? How were you thinking about it at the time? What did you think the possible outcomes were? How likely did you think those were? And if you actually have people do that work, then they can start to sort of get sight of what that full tree is, because you can kind of think about it, again, going back to this idea of there's only one past, right? There's only one thing that happens, and we tend to think about that as deterministic. So just by reminding people about what are all the other things that could have happened were, and that each of those had some chance of occurring, it helps people to get back into that probabilistic zone.
I loved that tree so much. So essentially, instead of looking at binary, you say, let me think of this like a tree, and I'm going to have all the branches. And normally, as you write, what we do is we sort of chop off all the other limbs of the tree and say,
Right.
here was my decision. So talk a little bit about how one might build the tree. And I loved your example of how you decide to move to a different city to take a job. So talk a little bit about building that decision tree, and also how you will likely have a better outcome.
Let's say that I'm thinking about taking a job. And the example I give is, let's say you live in the South and you're trying to decide whether to take a job in Boston. And the reason that I use that is that it adds some uncertainty, because you don't necessarily know how you're going to do with the weather if you've only lived in the South your whole life. Basically, instead of thinking about it as a binary, like it's either going to be great or it's not, think about what the reasonable outcomes for that are. So I give some suggestions in the book. Like, it could be you love the job, but you hate Boston. It could be you love the job and you love Boston. It could be the job is okay and you really love Boston. So, since you don't like the job that much, you actually end up getting a different job, but you stay in Boston. It could be that you become like a winter sports enthusiast, and you don't really care whether you like your job or not, because you just like the city so much. It could be that you hate both of them and you end up moving back home. So you basically think about what are the possible ways it could turn out. If you were to translate that into like a hiring decision, you can also think about it not as kind of broad scenarios, but maybe there's some feature of the decision that you really care about. So if you're hiring because you're trying to reduce turnover, as an example, because your recruitment costs are through the roof, you could say, I'm hiring a candidate. Let me think about, is the candidate going to be with us in 6 months? Will they be with us in 6 months to 18 months? Will they be with us beyond 18 months? So you could hone in, for example, on a particular feature that you really cared about of the decision. And then once you've done that and you've figured out what those possibilities are, then what you want to do is kind of order them by preference, and then figure out how likely do you think those things are to occur. Because really, that's what a decision is. And that's why you want to do this explicitly. Even if I'm doing something really simple, like trying to decide between ordering the chicken and the fish in a restaurant, really, that's a probabilistic forecast. What I'm saying is that I think that I am more likely, although not guaranteed, to like the chicken better than the fish. So there's some probability that you're going to like the chicken. There's some probability that you're going to like the fish. And in fact, it could be more likely than not that you would like both. But the fact that you've chosen the chicken implies that you think there's a higher probability that you'll enjoy the chicken. This is what we do with every decision, simple ones and complex ones. So if we actually take the time to map out these trees and forecast what we think the likelihood are, we're going to just be better decision makers.
And you actually have sort of a definition of what makes a good tool. You say that it can be reliably repeated,
Mhm.
that it can be taught to someone else. And I love the third part, which is after you've used that tool, you can look back and examine whether you used it properly or not. So, Annie, tell us how you've done your decision making and looked back and maybe said, oh, this was the right process, this was the wrong process. Tell us a little bit about that in your own life.
Yeah, oh my gosh. So that's such a good description of what a good tool is. So you can see how like a screwdriver fits that definition, right? I can use it for the same purpose reliably. I could teach you how to use it and then we could look at how I used it to figure out if I did a good job. And one thing I just want to say there is that that's why your gut is a terrible decision tool. You can't actually improve the decision making of your team by saying, well, I felt it in my gut. Because they obviously then they can't repeat the process or understand how you did it. And you can't go back and examine whether you did it well, which by the way is the only reason that you can learn, right? If you can go back and examine your decision process. So for me, I can take an example from poker. What I would do with a poker hand is obviously I'm in the process of I'm doing the hand. I can't record the hand in the same way that I can a longer decision process because poker's happening very quickly. But then if I wanted to understand what I thought about the hand, what I'd do is come to you and I would really run the hand in an iterative way. So I would know what my reasoning was. I would have some jotting down of my reasoning for the hand and exactly what happened so that I could remember the moves in the hand and why I wanted to do them. So I would have that in hand and then I can go to you and I could say, somebody raised in front of me and I would give you the facts you need to know about the game, like what the stack sizes were, what positions they were in, and so on and so forth. And I would say, and then I look down at ace queen. I'd love to know what you think I should have done.
Mm.
And notice I already know what I did, but I don't want to sort of bias you with my own opinion because I want to see what your view of what I did is. So I have some record of my thinking and my rationale and what I did. I'm not sharing that with you though, as I'm getting your advice. And this actually allows for that really good examination of how I use the screwdriver because you're now able to offer your own opinion about what tools you think, we would want to use there and how you would process that. And I can now compare that against my process.
I think it's so interesting to be able to bring somebody else into the process also, especially if you're thinking about this in terms of teams or your organization at work. And as you say, hiring, so I'm looking at it from both angles, which is so often you say, I went through this process and I have a process for hiring and we brought this person on and we went through the whole rigmarole and the person still flamed out. It's interesting to gather the team up and say, did we actually step away from our process in some way? You do work with organizations, right? Doesn't that happen a lot? Like there's actually a procedure and then they don't follow it?
Yeah, so I think number one is that they don't follow it. And number two is that a lot of when they're thinking about the procedures, they're doing them in group settings.
And so what does that mean?
It's not that you shouldn't have discussion in group settings. I'm not saying that. It's that what should happen before you get into the group setting should be independent and asynchronous.
We'll get back to our interview with Annie Duke in just a minute. Hey, during the break, why don't you go to the website, JillOnMoney.com, sign up for our free weekly newsletter? Why not? You can do it. You can always buy our book on the line also, buy the book, The Dumb Things Smart People Do With Their Money, 13 Ways to Right Your Financial Wrongs. We'll be right back.
Do I invest here? Should I put my money there? Jill Schlesinger can help you. Back to Jill on Money.
You're back. It's Jill on Money. And we are in the middle of an interview that we recorded post-pandemic with Annie Duke. She is really a fascinating interviewee. Love talking to her. She's written a couple of books, and she is very good at articulating the ideas behind how to make a good decision, how to have a good system behind your decision making. And when we were talking in this segment, we were discussing hiring. And I thought what was interesting about this is that obviously many of us are in the position where we interview people. And it may just be in your real life. You might be interviewing a contractor. You might be interviewing a babysitter. You might be interviewing somebody who's going to do something for you. In this part of the interview, we're talking about when you're interviewing, what does success look like? How does that kind of pan out? What kind of decision making are you doing? I like this because there's a practical aspect of it. It really is helpful to hear her describe it. So here is more of our interview with author Annie Duke.
So if we're thinking about a particular candidate that we're going to hire, what we want to think about is exactly what does success look like for that candidate. We want to figure out what that is. And then we want to figure out what do we think the signals are from that candidate, the qualities that we're looking for that would tell us that we're going to get the success that we're looking for. So it may be like, for example, we have some definition and we would want to define these terms. We have some definition of what a good mentor would be. And this is something that we think is incredibly important to that person being a successful hire. So we would put that on our hiring rubric. Where we would want to rate their mentorship, what we think their mentorship abilities is going to be, on a scale of 0 to 5. We may just want to know, like, what on a scale of 0 to 5, like, what are their data analysis skills if we're hiring for that. But you figure out what are those things that you think are really important in terms of a successful hire. Really make those explicit, and then make sure that you're eliciting feedback on those features in some way that's quite precise. So even though you have a subjective judgment, it doesn't mean you can't be precise in the way you express it. That's why you would say on a scale of 0 to 5, how good of a mentor do we believe that this person's going to be? Now, when you do that rubric, though, what generally happens is you'll have something like that, and then everybody discusses it in a group. The problem there is that you'll generally start talking a lot about consensus, and you'll actually shut the process down too early. Because once you start to see consensus build, there'll generally be velocity behind that consensus. And then you don't actually explore what everybody's opinions actually are. And particularly as there's consensus, people who have corrective or negative perspectives on what the consensus of the group is will be unlikely to express it. So instead, if you take the group and you give each member of the group the rubric and have them offer their opinions independently prior to actually talking about it in the group, and then bring those together into some sort of central hub, sorted into general areas of agreement and general areas of dispersion of opinion. Now, when you come into the group, you can acknowledge the areas of agreement, which frankly are kind of uninteresting. We both believe the earth is round. Okay. And you can focus on the areas where there's dispersion. And the reason why that's really important is it's kind of the opposite of the way that group discussions tend to work, which get very groupthinky. And why do you have a team in the first place? You have a team so that you can get different perspectives. You can access different mental models. You can understand the different facts that people are bringing to bear on the types of opinions and judgments that they're making. And this actually allows you to see what the group thinks, to improve the information that's going into the decision process, which is the thing you really have control over. Beyond just having a good process, that's pretty easy to do. It's how do you improve the quality of the information that you're inputting into that process? And this is really one of the main ways to do that.
You know, we talk a lot on this show about investing, about making financial decisions. And in my previous career, when I was a financial planner and investment advisor, I'm always trying to get people to imagine really horrible things. And I want to say to them, well, of course, this is unlikely, but. And I guess this is a little bit of trying to explain to people that bad things can happen. We can protect against those bad things, and have them try to imagine what it would feel like if, God forbid, you died when you were 35 years old and you left your family destitute. Now, is there some part of the pre-mortem process that you created in the book that you talk about where you can get people to imagine these potential outcomes before they're really bad? Like, what is it that is important to give people in terms of the ways to imagine bad stuff?
Yeah. So first of all, I just want to say I didn't invent pre-mortems. I do build on the concept that comes from Gary Klein. So basically, people talk about the power of positive thinking all the time. And it's obviously incredibly popular. This idea that you set a positive destination for yourself and then you imagine success along the way. When I think about the power of positive thinking, I think that if you really want to have success, that the power of positive thinking is actually not the best way to go. And the reason is that if you just imagine success all along the way, you're going to be really unprepared for the obstacles that are inevitably going to be in your path. So, what I think is like, look, imagine a positive destination, right? Like, I want to plan for my family to be financially secure, right? So that would be an example of a positive goal. But then it's actually quite helpful to engage in something that's called broadly mental contrasting. And this is a lot of work from Gabrielle Odejan, who's at NYU, who shows that when you actually imagine the ways that you might fail, the ways that things might go wrong, that you actually are increasing by a lot your chances of success. So, as an example, she looked at people who had to lose over 50 pounds in a weight loss program. That was what they wanted to do. And she had one group do positive thinking, which is imagining, like, I'm going to go to the gym and I'm going to get there every day and I'm going to eat healthy and I'm going to pack my lunch and all my friends are going to notice and my dating life is going to improve. But then she had another group where she specifically told them to think about the ways that things might go wrong. So they're thinking about, like, what if I get really busy and I don't make it to the gym? Gosh, people are always bringing treats into the break room at work and it's just so hard to resist. And I'm really afraid I'm not going to be able to resist them. And that's going to make it so that I don't lose weight. Or none of my friends are going to notice and my dating life isn't going to improve. So they're imagining like all the things that might go wrong in this process. Now, the power of positive thinking would tell you that the first group is going to end up being much more successful than the second, but it's actually the reverse. The second group loses on average 26 more pounds than the first group does.
We'll get back to our interview with Annie Duke in just a minute. Here is a great idea. When you're on our website, Jill on Money, just go and click right below it and you can get all the information about the podcast. You can subscribe. It's very easy to do. So check it out. Our website is jillonmoney.com and we will be right back.
.401ks, IRAs, refinancing, she covers it all. Back to Jill on Money with Jill Schlesinger.
You're back. It's Jill on Money, and we are talking to author Annie Duke. And one of the things that I love talking to her about is not only how we make really better decisions and how we have a better process to make those decisions, but also how we can use this decision making in our financial lives. And you guys hear me talk about this all the time. You hear me discuss, what is it that's holding you back? And I try to nudge you along a little bit. But in this part of our interview with Annie Duke, what we're really trying to do is have you focus on imagining some bad stuff up front so you don't have to deal with it on the other end. Meaning, what is it that's holding you back? What is this bad thing? Is it, I don't want to think about my will because that brings up my own death, or I don't want to deal with life insurance because it makes me sad about my kids, whatever it is. So in this part of the interview, we're trying to help you imagine that bad stuff so that you don't need to perseverate about it in the future. You don't have to go in a mindless, mind-numbing loop in the future. Here's more of our interview with Annie Duke.
Being prepared for the things that might go wrong, it allows you to do things about that before those things go wrong. So the way I like to think about it is there's a reason why an app like Waze is so popular, because Waze is the power of negative thinking. It's saying, here's where you want to get to. That's the positive goal. But by the way, there's really heavy traffic on this route, or there's a speed trap over here, or someone got in an accident over here. And then what does it do? It redirects you around those obstacles so that you can still get to your destination safely. And that's what you're talking about. So you can take this general idea of negative, the power of negative thinking or mental contrasting, and then turn that into a pre-mortem, which involves imagining that you've already failed and why that happened. So it's kind of moving yourself forward in time. And that actually generates a lot more of these obstacles that you might want to deal with, because you get less hooked on the obstacles that might be in your immediate path. And then you can do all sorts of things. Like, just think about this. In finance, That's what hedging is.
And in personal finance, I think it's like you want to plan for this worst case outcome. Okay. I need to consider getting my estate in order. We just interviewed a woman whose father had been diagnosed with cancer and for quite some time was ill. And only 10 days before his death did they finally get him to sign all the documents.
Oh
You
my
don't even
gosh.
have to imagine that something bad has happened. Something bad's happening. And I've heard this over and over. And so what I always try to say to people is, I do imagine that you're leaving your heirs with just a hot mess of problems. And imagine that instead of grieving you, they're cursing you because you're the most selfish relative in the world who didn't take the time to create this plan. And so I use a little of the Jewish guilt. It seems to work some, but
Yeah.
essentially you're saying that you think positive and you plan negative.
Right. So that's actually a really good example of thinking positive and planning negative, right? Like the positive goal is I would like to leave my heirs in good shape. And then you're saying, imagine that you failed to do that. Imagine that you left them a hot mess and they're now cursing you after you're dead. Why do you think that happened? And now obviously they're going to get to the right answer of, well, I guess because I didn't do my estate planning and I drugged my feet and I kept committing to do it and I didn't have these contingencies in place and so on and so forth. So you still have the positive goal. The whole point is that you want to provide for your family. But what you're asking them to do is imagine that you failed. I always think about like, why is it that people are so reluctant to do this? And I think about the book, The Secret. Do you remember that book? The
Oh
Secret?
my God. Yes. So silly, but
Yeah.
yes.
So here's the thing about The Secret, and this is why I think that this kind of pre-mortem, why you could have someone who hasn't, they only get them to sign it 10 days in advance, of the actual death. I think that there's this real sense of magical thinking that your thoughts actually do create stuff. And that if you imagine success will be created out of that it's really causal. And if you imagine failure of any sort, that will create failure. Now, when you look at the normal power of positive thinking, they're only talking about the first part. They're saying if you imagine success, it will increase your chances of success. But it's obviously implied in there that if you imagine failure, it will create failure, even though the science tells you that if you imagine failure, it will create success. But that's implied in there. And I think it's playing into this magical thinking that we all kind of engage in. And that's where The Secret comes into play, because The Secret makes it all explicit. Imagine that your partner gives you a diamond ring and you'll get a diamond ring. Imagine that you're in traffic the next day and you're going to be in traffic the next morning. Now, I always wonder there, like when you get in that traffic, did you imagine traffic for everybody else, or is everybody who's in the traffic thinking bad traffic thoughts? I could never quite figure that one out. And then they posit this causal thing, which has to do with like the magnetism of your brainwaves. I mean, the whole thing is totally kooky and ridiculous. But the reason why it's so popular is that it does play into that magical thinking that we have. Imagine it and it will come. I imagine that that's why people sort of drag their feet so much on that, because they're worried that, well, if I actually do this thing, it will happen. As if I get fire insurance for my house, maybe I'm going to create a fire. I also just really specifically want to distinguish this from positive visualization. I think in the sports sense, it's really good to sort of imagine that great free throw, just in order to get that sort of like muscle memory going, like of, sort of imagining the great free throw. But we know that that's different than what we're talking about, because Larry Bird also spent hours and hours and hours practicing the free throws, because he understood that that was the way that he would fail. So I don't want to conflate positive visualization, like in a sports sense, to imagining you doing something well, which I think is actually quite helpful, with the kind of planning, the route planning part.
Okay, we'll get back to our interview with Annie Duke in just a minute. If you've got a financial question, send us an email. Ask Jill at jillonmoney.com. We'll be right back. Okay, here's the last segment of our interview with Annie Duke. We're talking about The Queen's Gambit. All right, random question. Have you watched The Queen's Gambit on Netflix?
I just finished it last night.
I love this so much. So tell me how when you watch that, when you were watching, this young woman journey through the chess world, how the application of how to decide, because I was thinking about it last night when I was watching an episode. It was like front and center for me. So the two things collided.
You know how she'll imagine playing out the games, and she'll play out a particular line in her imagination, and then she'll go back, and then she'll play out another line, and she'll go back, and she'll play out another line of play, and she'll go back. So this is actually exactly what we're talking about in terms of those branches of the tree, which is what I was doing in poker. What do I think is going to happen if I raise here? What do I think is going to happen if I call? What do I think is going to happen if? That's what she's doing. She's exploring all the different branches of the tree. This is the power of negative thinking, right? She's planning that route by seeing which of those routes are going to fail and which ones have the highest probability of success. So she's going through and she's saying, okay, if I move this way, what are the chances that I fail this way? If I move this way, what are the chances I fail this way? If I move this way, what are the chances that I fail this way? Or what are the chances that I succeed this way? So she's trying to determine which moves are going to create upside and are going to have a positive expected value, in other words, comprise the upside, and which moves are going to have a negative expected value and then create the downside. And then she's thinking about not just that, but if I take this move, now this goes into mental contrasting, and I lose the game, how might that happen? Because she's thinking about the way that the other person is going to counterattack against it. And so those are the places where you're going to fail, right? So she's imagining what those counterattacks might be and then figuring out what her response would be. If she doesn't go deep into the game in that way and imagine what the counterattacks are going to be, she's constantly going to be surprised by what her opponent does. And this actually is the difference between a great chess player and a good one, is that a good one or a mediocre one is surprised by their opponent's moves all the time. But you notice how quickly she moves in that game.
Yes.
And it's because she already knows that that's a possibility, and she's already planned for what her response is going to be if they do that.
Thanks so much to Annie Duke. It was great to interview her. If you've got a question that's about your decision-making process, send us an email, askjill@jillonmoney.com. And next hour, not one guest, but two guests. Stay tuned. We'll be right back.
It's the weekend, and that can only mean one thing. You're listening to Jill on Money, the show that takes the mystery out of your finances. Here's your host, Jill Schlesinger.
You're back. It's Jill on Money. It is hour number 2, and we are broadcasting from the Policy Genius virtual studios. Policy Genius is the easy way to compare and buy insurance. Just go to policygenius.com. Okay, so last hour, it was the Annie Duke interview. This hour, we've got not one, but two interviews. We are going to start with columnist Rana Foroohar. She is a columnist at the Financial Times, great writer. She's been on the show previously. That's why you might recognize that name. Her first book was called Makers and Takers, and she really focused on the financialization of the economy. And I thought it was a really well done book. I know there were a ton of books out at the time about the same topic. Well, Rana is now taking on big tech. And it's, boy, more important than ever. You're seeing it all over the news. In her next book, it's called Don't Be Evil. It's an indictment of the big tech firms. And in this interview, I think you're going to hear a lot about how these firms have become so powerful and why we need to rein them in. Here is our interview with Rana Foroohar. What was the best financial or career decision you've ever made?
Oh, wow. What a good question. To develop a portfolio career. A few years ago, I was at a point in my career where I could have stayed on the management track and become an editor-in-chief somewhere, had the big job with the big title. And it was interesting. A lot of my male peers were very much kind of drawn to that direction. But I really, as somebody covering business and the economy, I looked out and I thought, I think we're headed to a world in which flexibility is going to be what's valued and the ability to move across platforms. So I was a print journalist at the time, and I thought, I want to do video. I want to do radio. I got an on-air contract with CNN. I started doing work with NPR. I started writing books. And so now I think of myself as a little mini entrepreneur. And I've got kind of 5 legs on my stool. So if one of those legs breaks, or 2 or 3, that's going to happen. You got a couple there in reserve.
I love a diversified portfolio stream.
Exactly.
It's a beautiful thing. So let me start by asking you, you were covering financial services, right?
Yeah.
So what made you move into tech?
Well, it was interesting. The last book that I did, the first chapter was actually about Apple, because I was, that book was about financial markets, and I was trying to find what are the craziest ways in which companies are playing the financial markets. And at that time, Apple had like $300 billion of cash on the balance sheet. It was giving a bunch back to shareholders in the form of buybacks, which kind of artificially pushes the markets up. And I thought, that's really weird. Well, since then, all the tech firms have started doing that. The money has gone from Wall Street to Silicon Valley. They have become, in some ways, the new too-big-to-fail institutions. They're at the center of our economy, our politics, as we know. Election disinformation, still a huge issue. And also there's a social angle on this, which I get into in the book, that my son actually became a video game addict, which was one of the prompts for writing this.
So you started the book with that story about your son. If you wouldn't mind, can you recount what happened and how that immersed you in this?
Yes, it's seared in my brain forever. I had just started at the FT, actually, and I was writing about the world's biggest business, tech, economy stories. And so I was starting to look at just how much money was in Silicon Valley. And just one quick stat before I tell you about my son, 80% of corporate wealth today is held by just 10% of firms. And the biggest ones are the ones we know: Amazon, Google, Facebook, Apple. So these companies have basically ring-fenced the world's wealth. So I was thinking about that. I come home one day and I find a credit card bill. I open it up and I see all these tiny charges, $1.99, $3, $5. And I'm going through and I think, my God, I've been hacked, But then I start to notice they're all from the App Store. And I think, who else has my password? My 10-year-old son, Alex. I go downstairs, and he's, of course, on his phone, as always. I have to pry him off of it. And I ask him what's going on, and he sort of, turns white. Well, it turns out he has downloaded one of those free, and I put free in quotation marks, soccer games. And this is a sort of game that kids get into, and it draws them in, and then they're sold these what's called in-app purchases, loot boxes. They don't know that they're really spending real money, but if they want to move ahead in the game, they have to buy virtual Ronaldo, or they have to get a pair of cool shoes for their player, and that's real money. So over $900. And 1 month later, Alex was at the top of the league scores. I am freaking out. I was horrified as a mother, but I was fascinated as a journalist.
And so where did that take you in terms of how you were diving into these tech companies?
First of all, I thought, okay, this is unbelievable. This is the most interesting business model I've ever seen, because this is a business model that gets inside your brain and pulls you where the companies want you to go. So I started looking into it. And the first interesting thing I found was that these technologies, these persuasive technologies, are actually part of an entire industry. Many of them came out of something called the Stanford Persuasive Technology Lab, which is rather Orwellian sounding.
Yeah, I'll say.
And they bring kind of casino gaming techniques, variable rewards, the same kind of things that keep you pulling a slot machine. That's now in your phone. So you have a slot machine in your pocket all the time. And as I began to think about that model, I realized these companies are, to quote Columbia academic Tim Wu, attention merchants, right? It's about keeping us online as long as possible so that they can harvest our data. I studied some of the cognitive effects for this book, and they're particularly pernicious for children whose brains are sort of more malleable. I mean, all of us get distracted by this stuff. And P.S., we touch our phones hundreds of times a day, and every time we do that, that's a little pull away from our work. But kids in particular are really being reshaped by this. It's fascinating because a lot of college professors, high school teachers are finding that kids are coming in and they cannot do the sort of core reading that you and I used to do as part of our curriculum. In college, you go to college, you're probably reading a couple hundred pages a week of text. Kids can't do that anymore. They are so used to living in a world of high-speed images and always-on technology that they can't focus, they can't concentrate anymore. And it's interesting, reading levels have been declining. Only about a third of teenagers read more than once a month for pleasure now, long-form text. So this is having profound effects. And one of the things I recommend actually in the book is that we probably need to have at some point an FDA of technology just to study what the impacts are. It's a bit like nicotine. You know, everybody smoked, everybody's mom smoked until we knew, hey, this stuff's bad for you.
I want to get back to something you started with, which was about, these companies have concentrations of wealth. And you go through all the data where they basically own each of their industries. They are essentially monopolies. But you also say not as monopoly is defined by law as of Robert Bork's argument.
Well, exactly. And that's such an important point. So since the 1980s onward, we've had this sort of what's called the Chicago School of Thought. Robert Bork was kind of one of the big brain guys behind this that says as long as consumer prices are falling, you don't have a monopoly problem. So that's why you can get a company in the previous generation like Walmart, for example, that can come in and take over entire town squares and run small businesses out. But that's not a monopoly problem because prices are falling. We'll take that paradigm and put it onto these new digital giants like an Amazon. Yeah, prices are falling. We all know and love how cheaply we can get stuff online, but we're not paying in dollars. We're paying in data. So that is a really different kind of transaction, and you can't judge it by the same monopoly standards.
We'll get back to our interview with Rana Foroohar in just a minute. When you are on our website, JillOnMoney.com, don't forget to sign up for our free weekly newsletter. It's so easy. It's free, and it comes out every Friday. Mark does a great job with that. So go there right now, sign up, and then when you're done, we'll be ready to talk to you again. Okay, we'll be right back.
Back to Jill on Money, where Jill Schlesinger helps you take the mystery out of your finances.
You're back. It's Jill on Money. We're talking to Rana Foroohar. She is a columnist from the Financial Times. We are focusing on her new book, which came out early last year, called Don't Be Evil. It really is an interesting journey in terms of how did these big companies, which started ostensibly for good reasons, how did they lose their moral compass? How did they lose the ability to see that some of their practices were just so heinous? I think that when you hear Rana describe it, it will help you understand a lot about what the whole antitrust issue is around some of these companies, how they've become so powerful, how they have really started to influence society in such a big way. So to that end, we are going to finish up our interview with Rana Foroohar. Again, the book is called Don't Be Evil. And we recorded this before the pandemic, so there's no pandemic talk. Okay, here is the rest of our interview with Rana. The prices have come down, but they also gobble up their competition pretty aggressively.
Oh, 100%. One of the things that I found very interesting is that a lot of folks in Silicon Valley are actually worried about the big companies because if you're a startup, if you're a venture capitalist that's trying to move into an area that a Google or a Facebook or an Amazon is in, it's nearly impossible. They have ring-fenced all the data. So think about it. Amazon is basically 60% of all e-commerce in the world right now. It's where most people start their online shopping. Google is 85% of searches. Facebook is almost the entire social media world. If you're trying to get into these spaces, you can't, either because companies are being bought up or because they simply can't get started. There's just no oxygen in the room.
And you also recount that, from a political point of view, that these companies kind of curried favor with the Obama administration.
Yeah.
So for those 8 years where there was real growth and a lot of things were going on. I know the financial crisis occupied quite a bit of time and healthcare occupied a lot of time, but it seemed like there was what we used to call in financial services regulatory capture. It was almost like it's like the capture there. But is this real, or is this just, hey, we ought to break up these big companies?
So it's a super interesting question right now. Just to go to your point, big tech, Google and Amazon in particular, are now the number one corporate lobbyists in Washington. And by the way, I studied that sort of regulatory capture issue in the financial sector. What has happened in big tech is so much more profound because they've bought out not only the politicians, they've bought out all the academics. I mean, it was almost impossible to find neutral research at this point because most academics in the field are being funded by one of these companies for their work. It's in very fine print at the bottom of these reports, which you got to read. Is this going to change? Well, we're hearing a lot from, say, Elizabeth Warren about breaking up big tech, which, to be fair, is a little more of a slogan than a solution. I do think, though, that you're starting to see this weird confluence of left and right political alignment over, you know what, maybe this is not good for our economy and our politics. And the reasons that the left and the right have are different. So liberals, Democrats care about corporate concentration of power. They care about wages. They're worried that we're going to see sort of the Uberization of everything, the rise of a gig economy. So they're worried about big tech for that reason. Conservatives are worried for two other reasons. One is that, the kind of moderate Midwestern conservatives are worried about small businesses just not being able to be founded. And indeed, if you look at the numbers, in the last 20 years, as big tech has risen and corporate concentration has gotten higher, the number of startups has fallen, the amount of entrepreneurial zeal in the economy has gone down. So Republicans worry about that. But they also worry that they're getting a raw deal because a lot of these firms are in very blue state California. They're card-carrying Democrats, although I would argue that they're more libertarian than liberal. But they worry that, hey, if there's some algorithmic bias going on, we may be on the wrong side of that.
Where does that leave the rest of the country when you're talking about job creation? Where does that leave the places that feel remote from these hubs?
Great question. I think big tech has contributed to what was already happening, which is this rise of a superstar economy, of a real winner-take-all economy. We were seeing that concentration for a couple of reasons. I mean, globalization definitely favored the coasts, but hollowed out the Rust Belt and parts of the Midwest, as we know. Technology has put all those trends on steroids. So now you've got basically 5 companies that are driving the S&P up or down. And the headquarters where those companies are where you see huge real estate gains, huge, wage hikes for certain kinds of jobs. You have a lot of PhD jobs, a lot of service jobs. It's basically the people that are coding and the people that are giving them massages have work, but nobody in between has work.
Right. Or you have like a bunch of warehouse jobs where these people are working their butts off have terrible back pains, et cetera. So I want to go back to this comparison between financial services and big tech. Now I look at technology, and I think the part of it that annoys someone like me, an old fart like me, is that they couch so much of what they do as virtue.
Yes. Oh, my gosh.
And it is insane to me.
It is insane. Do you remember when Lloyd Blankfein from Goldman made that comment?
God's work.
God's work. Well, these guys really believe it. He was being ironic.
Yeah.
The guys in the Valley, and they are mostly guys, let's face it, think that they are doing God's work. And that's what's so interesting. They've had this holier-than-thou quality to all this disruption. It's fine to move fast and break things, disrupt everything. I mean, society, politics, it's all considered to be in the way. And yet they don't want to take responsibility for the bad stuff. But I think we're getting to a tipping point there. I mean, I think everything from the fact that you now have public massacres, like what happened in Christchurch, New Zealand, being monetized on a platform like Facebook, that's something that gives people real pause. And it's bringing up something that they don't want us to talk about, which is the fact that this industry benefits from huge loopholes. So if you go back to the mid-1990s, they carved into the Communication Decency Act a loophole that means that they're not liable for anything that anybody does or says on their platforms. Think about that. I mean, Google and Facebook are giant media and advertising companies. That's where they get 90% of their income. And yet, unlike you or I, they are not liable. If one of their content creators does or says something not just untrue, but violent, that's not their problem. Well, I think it is going to be their problem. You're seeing, again, both on the left and the right, not to mention overseas, people saying, you know what? why should this industry get special exemptions now that it's, the largest, most powerful companies in the world, not entrepreneurs in a garage?
You write, the leadership at YouTube, Google, Facebook, and Twitter have known for years about the risks of platforms being misused by nefarious actors to send users down rabbit holes of propaganda. They just decided that fixing this problem wasn't worth the risks to their own business model. Has that changed?
I don't think it has changed profoundly. They do a lot of tweaking. Every few months you see some new blog post from one of the big platforms saying, we've changed the algorithms, we're making them more user-friendly, we're making them less vulnerable to disinformation. I don't think it's profoundly changed. I actually had an interesting conversation with a YouTube engineer as part of the reporting for the book, and he had tried to convince folks. He was worried, as many engineers have been, about political manipulation online. And he had tried to shift the business model so that when you are on YouTube, for example, as we all know, if you click on cat videos, you get more cat videos. But if you click on right-wing hate, you get more right-wing hate.
Yeah, you're like with the Nazis in 5 seconds.
Exactly. He wanted to offer people a broader range of content, the argument being that this is not only good for society, but maybe we'll actually get them to stay and figure out different ways to use the platform, and that'll be good for us business-wise. Well, it was profitable in experiments that they ran, but not as profitable as just sending them down the rabbit hole. So he wasn't able to affect that change.
And of course, these are people who created amazing innovations.
Yeah.
And if they had decided they wanted to solve this problem, they would.
That's what I can't get my brain around. I mean, come on. If you can create Google, you can help us fix this problem.
Exactly. And even if you were so naive that you didn't see it, maybe they were.
They are so opaque. I mean, nobody can see in it. Regulators don't know what the algorithms are doing. There's no public transparency. A Google or an Apple now almost underwrite new corporate bond offerings the way a Goldman Sachs does. They have so much spare cash that they don't know what to do with. They've been going in recent years and buying up a lot of the new bond offerings in the corporate world. They're holding this record amount of corporate debt now. I mean, whose debt is it? I don't know. You don't know. They don't have to record it.
Well, thanks again to Rana Foroohar. It seems like a million years ago when I could talk to people in a studio, but times have changed. When we return, we've got another guest for you, a former FBI agent who is a very cool guy. So stay tuned. And what do I have to do with an FBI agent? I know. I'm thinking the same thing. Okay, we'll be right back.
Do I invest here? Should I put my money there? Jill Schlesinger can help you. Back to Jill on Money.
You're back. It's Jill on Money. And we are shifting gears. We were just talking to Rana Foroohar about big tech. If you missed any part of that interview, just go to the website, Jill on Money. After the show, you can listen to what Mark does. Brilliant. Gets any part you missed right there for you. Now we are going to talk to a former FBI agent. His name is Robin Dreeke. And he wrote a book a while back called Sizing People Up. And here's a subtitle: A Veteran FBI Agent's User Manual for Behavior Prediction. Aha, now you're interested, aren't you? All right, let's get into it. Our interview with Robin Dreeke. You grew up in New York.
Yep.
And then what happened? You went to...
I went to the Naval Academy. It was my dream to go there for a long time. I had a great friend of the family, he's a United Airlines pilot, and my family didn't have much money at all, and I was always enamored by his. And his I Love Me room was amazing. He flew A-4 Skyhawks during Vietnam off of one of the aircraft carriers, and I wanted to do that.
I mean, it's hard to get into Annapolis. Can you just, because a lot of people who may not be part of military, they don't know that West Point and Annapolis, these are very difficult institutions to gain entry. How do you get in?
For me, it was a lot of due diligence and tenacity. You need my son's there right now as well, so I do it from both sides. It took me an extra year to get in. About a third of every class comes from some other source, whether they're prior military, they spent a year in college, they went to prep school, or they were foundation sponsored by the Naval Academy. I was a foundation sponsored guy, so they kind of put you in a holding tank. They want you, but they want to make sure your grades are good enough because this is a hardcore engineering school.
Don't you have to get a politician to write a letter for you?
Hamilton Fish was my congressman at the time.
How about that?
And he's the one one that gave me my nomination.
Okay, so you go through Annapolis, grueling, and then what did you do coming out of the academy?
So when I first went there, I wanted to be aerospace engineer, astronaut, pilot. Failed out of aerospace engineering. My eyes went to 2030, and back then they were non-correctable for pilots. So I really got dismayed at the Navy a bit. So I wanted to go in Marine Corps. And that was really both the Naval Academy and Marine Corps were the first starting foundations on me understanding that I am not a natural born leader. I was a natural born self-centered narcissist.
Really?
And I had to create manuals, which my books are now, not to be the moron I was born to be.
So wait a minute. Did you find that out because like someone gave you feedback? How did that occur?
I was in a squadron in the Marine Corps where we had 14 second lieutenants, and the military is fantastic at constantly rating each other. And I was ranked last out of all 14 on my first reval. And so I go to the major and say to him, I said, all right, I get it, sir. I'm doing something wrong. The only gift I was given, I think, in life was the fact that I never blamed anything that happened on anyone else. I took accountability. And I said, what am I doing wrong? And he said, you just need to be a better leader. And I said, okay, thought I was. Give me some more. And he goes, you need to make it about everyone else but yourself. And again, I was like, thought I was. How? And he goes, I don't know, just do it. So from that point on, it became my life's pursuit to figure that out. And so every time I encountered someone, whether it was a leader or someone in sales or someone in my family, I don't care who it was, that had that natural magnetism that could develop trust and develop these great relationships and people love being around them, it became my mission in life to figure out exactly what behaviors are they doing, because I need to add that to myself to be successful.
Were you ever engaged in combat?
No, I was in during the in-between years between the first Gulf War and the next Gulf War. So
and so coming out of that, then what happened?
So my last duty station was Parris Island, South Carolina. I was a series commander down there. For people that know the military at all, I was one of the drafters of the Crucible. It was a final event at boot camp. And we had a guy from the FBI come down, a recruiter, basically, and saying, hey, I think Marine Corps officers make great FBI agents, and they're about to send me to Okinawa with my wife if I stayed in the Marine Corps. And I said, okay. I had two questions. I said, does all my military time count towards my retirement? And I'm 28 years old, and these are the questions I'm asking.
Smart.
And the next question I asked was, what's the retirement rate? How many people actually stay on and make it to retirement? He said 95 to 98%. I said, all right, so I have 9 years counts towards my retirement already, which is 9% of my average high 3, and people generally stay. It must be good, and I got to continue to do something patriotic for my country.
Okay, so now you're in the FBI. What's it like to make that career change? Because obviously you're now in your third major different ecosystem.
Right.
And what's it like for you?
It depends on your age and experience. You know, when you first come into any organization, I believe, you come in very optimistic, very naive about how things work, and you really have a sense that the entire organization is about the mission. You know, my mission is I work nothing but counterintelligence the entire time. My mission was protect national security. When different offices focus on different things, here in Manhattan, my job was to recruit Russian spies primarily. And so that was, I was so mission-oriented, but as my career progressed, I started seeing the other side where, well, you got some people that are more career-oriented than mission-oriented, and starting to understand how to communicate differently in those realms and manage relationships both internally and externally became part of a great learning challenge.
How do you recruit Russian people for our purposes here in the United States? Like, what is it that you were actually trying to do, and how do you find them? Like, what happens? 99%
of them are diplomats over here at the United Nations, so they're under diplomatic cover. I call this the toughest sales job in the world.
Okay.
Because my job is to sell a service, and my service I'm selling is American patriotism. So first of all, sell that product to a foreign national spy. So generally, they don't want that product. The second challenge is because of laws and treaties, it's illegal for me to actually initiate contact with one of them as FBI, so I can't even approach my potential client. Third, they've done nothing illegal 99% of the time, so they have no compulsion to have to talk to me either. So those are the challenges. So how do you actually recruit them? It's very simple. Just like you do with anything in life. Relationships are based upon similarities, liking, which is tough if you're not allowed to communicate. But the other thing is you talk in terms of people's priorities, because when you're trying to sell something, and I'm selling patriotism, all I'm looking for is, does this person have goals, objectives, and priorities that I have resources to service? And so you don't actually recruit anyone. You actually see whose priorities align with yours in the sense of a dying wish of a grandmother or grandfather was that their children won't grow up under that oligarch regime or in this part of the world, or they want more opportunities. And so this is what the foundation of what makes human beings extremely predictable. Everyone can predict what all human beings are going to do all the time. We're always going to act in our own best interest in terms of our own safety, security, and prosperity as we see it. And so all you have to do is figure out what they think that is, offer resources, and then you're going to have a relationship.
We'll get back to our interview with Robin Dreeke in just a minute. While you are contemplating what you need to do to really think about how to size people up or what role that's going to play in your life, maybe you should also say to yourself, wait, I have a question and I don't want to let it go. If you've got a financial question, send us an email. Ask Jill at jillonmoney.com. We'll be right back.
.401ks, IRAs, refinancing, she covers it all. Back to Jill on Money with Jill Schlesinger.
You're back. It's Jill on Money. And we are in the middle of our second interview of the hour, our third of the show. This might be I don't know. I was going to say, Mark, it was a record, but maybe it's not. Anyway, we are in the midst of an interview with a former FBI agent. His name is Robin Dreeke. You know, this guy was a behavior analyst in the FBI. And so he surely does know how to size people up. And in this next part of the interview, what he's going to do is describe some of the things that he outlines in his book, the 6 signs for behavior prediction. You're going to want to think about this. Now, it may not be as corny as you think about eyes are shifting around. But okay, there are other real things that are going on. I encourage you to keep your mind open and see how you might be able to apply some of these signs into your real life, right? That's the cool part. So here is more of our interview with former FBI agent Robin Dreeke. So now let's get into the book a little bit, because you say that we all can employ some of the things that you have learned. You outlined 6 signs for behavior prediction. Can we go through a couple of these?
Sure.
Okay. I'm interested in sign number 3 about reliability.
Sure.
Because I find that I'm a natural extrovert and I'm a salesperson also. So I build relationships. I rely on a certain gut instinct and a connection, but a lot of people feel like they don't have that. So how do you develop that?
The gut instinct part can be really kind of trippy. It can really mess you up a little bit. I see gut instinct as kind of coming from 2 different areas as I've really thought deeply about this. The first one is liking someone. We basically like someone if they share the same morals, ethics, beliefs, very subjective, observable things. We like someone. But just because you like someone doesn't mean you can actually reasonably predict what they're going to do. And a lot of times we transfer liking to trusting, and that can be dangerous because trusting to me is not, it's beyond just trust. It's about predictability, so I can reasonably expect something from you. And the other part of that intuition part is liking. The other half is what most human beings are actually pretty good at. And this is where I bet you're really good at too. If you feel you get a gut feeling on someone, you probably rely more on this, which is we're always looking for basically congruence between the nonverbal someone's giving off and the words they're saying. Because in other words, if you have a bad salesman that gives you the creepy feeling, it's not because of what they're saying, it's because the emotion doesn't back up what they're saying. In other words, they're saying, I'm here to offer you resources so you can have safety, security, and prosperity for you and your family by buying this car. But at the same time, what they're really saying internally is, I'm going to get as much money out of you as I possibly can. And as human beings, our ancient reptilian brain is picking up on there's a disconnect. That's the same reason why when you walk into a workplace in the morning, you can actually tell who's having a bad day before anyone even says anything.
Are there tells that people should know about, like how you experience that? Or is it that feeling? Because funny that you should say that. We get a ton of people who call up and they'll say, Joe Schmo, my investment advisor, has just said that I should buy a variable annuity, and I got a bad feeling from that. So maybe they're picking up on a nonverbal, but maybe there's something else going on. And how do you know when to trust it?
Like in a situation like that, if it seems a little odd, well, why do things seem odd? Well, because you've established a baseline of what normal is with this individual, and now there's a deviation from the baseline. And if they don't have transparency on why there's been a deviation, then there's attempted manipulation.
And they could be deviating in a way that is nonverbal as well.
Oh, yeah.
Right? Give us some nonverbal cues that you like.
So when I first started doing this, there's hundreds from the tip of your head to the tip of your toes. But I'm actually, since I'm now so much more focused on the words, I'm looking in the facial area. And what I'm looking for all the time when I'm engaging someone, I'm looking for comfort nonverbals. I'm looking for things that are saying, I'm open to a relationship with you. I call them ventral displays, whether it's an eyebrow elevation, so they're showing interest, whether it's definitely smiling. Smiling is a great indicator that there's rapport starting to develop. Maybe a slight head tilt, so you're exposing the side of your neck where the carotid artery is. That's ancient man saying, hey, I trust you not to rip out my throat. I'm looking for palms up ventral displays, so when they're talking and speaking to you, they don't have a palm down, but their palms are facing upwards, saying that they're open. So anything that's kind of up and open to you is a great way to see that someone is comfortable when engaging with you.
What tips for sort of a shy person in the workspace who maybe is perceived as somebody different than he or she sees himself?
I would say two things. So one, for the shy person, this is a methodology to actually put into practice step by step of how to engage when you choose to engage, and to make it about the other person, which a lot of times introverts tend to do really well anyway. But a lot of times they might have reticence to engage. So this is a step-by-step process to engage because you're focused on someone else. And what's also good about it is it gets freaks that like to overrun conversation like me to shut up and learn how to pay attention to someone else. So for the introverts, I would say that it's a methodology to get out more if you want to. Again, there's no judging in here whatsoever. But I think more so kind of where you started there was, how do you deal with, if you're an extrovert, dealing with someone that is a little more introverted and you see them pulling back or you see them a little reticent. Best thing ever is double the space. If you start engaging someone and you are too close to them from their perspective and you see them lean back a little bit away from you, do the same and double it.
So you're talking about physical space, but also emotional space?
Yeah.
How do you do that for yourself?
I watch the tempo and accommodate the tempo.
We'll get back to our interview with Robin Dreeke in just a minute. If you've got a financial question and you want to come on the air with us, send us an email, ask Jill at jillonmoney.com, and let us know if you want to come on the air. Mark will arrange the rest. We'll be right back. You're back. It's Jill on Money. Before we let Robin Dreeke get out of the studio, we actually had a really fascinating part of our interview. He talks about what you need to do to provide space to have more productive interactions. Here's the conclusion of our interview with former FBI agent Robin Dreeke. Talk about some of the emotional space that's required in real life, but also in your job.
So emotional space is about understanding what the other person is looking for and requires. And I'm looking for cues on that as well, non-verbally first. So in other words, if you start filling that space, I'm looking for comfort to begin with. And if I don't see comfort, that means I might see stress. And so if my actions, my words, my tempo is inducing stress, here's some things I might see. And this is going to cause me to first pull back. And I'm going to see maybe some eyebrow compression, like a furrowing of the eyebrow, some lip compression, expressing tension.
Like pursing of the lips?
Pursing the lips. Basically, I'm going to start seeing people pull away or start blocking with their bodies, blading away. All these things, I'm looking for people that are actually compressing into themselves because I'm causing it. And so if I start seeing that I'm causing, inducing stress, the first thing I do is I engage it and acknowledge, say, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. I'm doing too much talking, or I need to be quiet. I apologize, my fault. So I'll be very accommodating and vocalize it because I'm always big on transparency, because transparency is probably one of the most key things you need if you're going to have a relationship.
I also think that like in a work environment that sometimes we are uncomfortable with silence. Obviously, I'm in spoken word, right? And so there is this sense that it's okay to leave the space.
For an extrovert, it sounds like a million years when you introduce silence, but it is the most beautiful thing ever because, one, what helps you do it to begin with is start thinking in terms of how is the next thing I'm about to say going to be about them, or is it going to be about me? If it's about me, I need to shut up. So I slow down and cause those spaces to happen when I'm actually thinking about how do I make this entire conversation about them and not me. So that thoughtful process does slow me down when I'm really engaged, which gives us that space and that silence. And I've never had an instance where that silence did not produce magic.
Well, thanks so much for listening. Remember that we've been broadcasting from the Policy Genius studios. Policy Genius is the easy way to compare and buy insurance. As always, we want to remind you, wash your hands, wear your masks, maintain your physical distancing, do something nice for someone else today. We'll catch up with you next week. Happy and merry and all that stuff. See you next week.